June 15th, 1814, and the heat pressed down upon the church garden like a living thing, thick and merciless, as Eleanor Ashworth stood among the roses and watched her younger sister become a viscountess. The pale lavender of her gown felt like a quiet surrender, neither celebration white nor mourning black. Simply the color of a woman who had learned to fade into walls and doorways and the edges of ballrooms where no one thought to look. 5 seasons she had endured. 5 years of hopeful gowns and careful curls and smiles that grew more brittle with each passing spring. And now at 26, she stood in her sister's shadow one final time as Lydia, beautiful Lydia with her rosebud mouth and golden hair, pledged herself to Lord Henry Greville, while their mother wept with joy, and their father calculated how much of the family's mounting debts might now be quietly addressed. Eleanor felt nothing but a hollow exhaustion as she performed her role. Accepting congratulations meant for another, directing servants, ensuring the champagne flowed freely despite knowing exactly how much it cost and how little they could afford it. The guests clustered beneath the garden canopy, fanning themselves against the oppressive afternoon, and she heard their whispers as she always did, the pitying glances that followed her like faithful hounds. "Poor Eleanor," they murmured, "so clever but so plain. And what good is wit when one's face could curdle cream?" She had learned to let such words wash over her, to build walls of quiet dignity around the tender places where hope used to live. But today, those walls felt thin as tissue paper. It was near the rose arbor that she first noticed him, Frederick Ravenscroft, the Duke of Somerton, standing apart from the crowd with an expression of such profound boredom that it bordered on contempt. She knew him by reputation only, Greville's cousin, a widower these 3 years past, notorious for his impossible standards and cutting judgments, a man whose approval society craved and whose disapproval could destroy. His dark hair was slightly longer than fashion dictated, his jaw severe, and even from across the garden she could see the cold intelligence in his gaze as it swept dismissively over the assembled guests. She was refilling her glass of lemonade, seeking a moment's respite in the shade of the arbor, when his voice carried through the heavy air with devastating clarity. "I cannot fathom why Greville insists on parading the entire family before me," he was saying to a companion just beyond the trellis. "The mother is grasping, the father ineffectual. And as for the spinster sister, one can only assume nature was feeling particularly ungenerous that day. 5 seasons, and not a single offer. I am told she compensates with wit. Though I cannot imagine any amount of cleverness sufficient to overcome such unfortunate circumstances." The lemonade glass trembled in Eleanor's hand. She heard laughter, masculine and cruel, and something inside her that had been carefully contained for years, something built of every dismissal and every pitying glance and every dance left unpartnered, cracked open. She moved before thought could stop her, rounding the trellis to find the Duke mid-laugh, his signet ring catching the light as he gestured carelessly, and then her palm connected with his face, with a sound that silenced the entire garden. The crack of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the summer air. Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, stared at her with such complete shock that for one perfect moment Eleanor felt nothing but savage satisfaction. Then the gasps began, the whispers rising like a storm, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had just destroyed what little remained of her life. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The storm broke as the Ashworth carriage lurched away from the church, fat drops of rain splattering against the windows like the tears Lady Margaret refused to shed in public, but now released in great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. Eleanor sat pressed into the corner of the carriage, her palm still burning from the impact, watching lightning fracture the darkening sky and thinking how fitting it was that the heavens themselves seemed to mirror the destruction she had wrought. Lydia sat opposite in her wedding gown, yards of cream silk crushed against the carriage seat because there had been no time to change, no time for anything after the guests had scattered like startled birds, and Lord Greville had bundled his new bride into the carriage with barely concealed fury. Sir Thomas Ashworth had not spoken a single word since they departed, his face a mask of such profound disappointment that Eleanor found she could not look at him directly. "You have ruined everything," Lydia hissed, her beautiful face contorted with rage. "This was my day, my wedding, and you could not bear to let me have even this one moment of happiness without making yourself the center of attention." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest at her sister's words. But before she could respond, their mother turned on her with eyes red from weeping. "What possessed you, Eleanor? What madness took hold that you would strike a duke? A duke before half of London society?" The words tumbled out of Lady Margaret in a torrent of despair and disbelief. Eleanor's voice emerged steadier than she expected when she finally spoke. "Did any of you hear what he said about me? Did any of you care to ask why I might have been driven to such an action?" The silence that followed was answer enough, and so she told them, repeating Frederick Ravenscroft's words with cold precision, watching her mother's face shift from fury to something more complicated, watching her father's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Still it changes nothing," Lady Margaret said at last, her voice hollow now. "You have destroyed yourself utterly. No amount of provocation justifies striking the Duke of Somerton in public. By morning every drawing-room in London will know what you did, and we shall be fortunate if we are not all cut from society entirely." Father spoke then for the first time, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You will go to your Aunt Beatrice in Somerset until this scandal dies down. If it ever does, you will leave within the week, and you will stay there until I send word that you may return." Eleanor nodded, feeling strangely light, as though some heavy chain she had not known she was carrying had suddenly fallen away. Through the rain-streaked window, she could still see Frederick Ravenscroft standing in the garden, his hand pressed to his cheek, utterly motionless as the storm drenched him, and something in his stillness, in the way he had not called for her arrest or demanded satisfaction, struck her as deeply strange. The last image she had of him before the carriage rounded the corner was of a man who looked not angry but utterly bewildered, as though she had spoken to him in a language he was only beginning to understand. June 22nd, 1814, and the rain had finally begun to ease as the hired carriage crested the hill and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Aunt Beatrice's cottage nestled in the Somerset countryside, like something from a fever dream of pastoral simplicity. It was smaller than she had remembered from her single childhood visit, whitewashed walls half consumed by climbing roses that bloomed in defiant profusion despite the overcast sky, their petals heavy with raindrops that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage with her small trunk and her 3 precious books, a worn copy of Sense and Sensibility, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, and a treatise on natural philosophy that had scandalized her mother when she purchased it. And she stood for a moment, breathing air that smelled of wet earth and honeysuckle, and something she could not immediately name, but would later recognize as freedom. The cottage door flew open before she could knock, revealing Aunt Beatrice in all her eccentric glory, silver hair escaping its pins, an ink stain on her sleeve, and a fat orange cat named Wellington draped across her shoulders like a living fur stole. "My dear scandalous girl," Aunt Beatrice declared, pulling Eleanor into an embrace that smelled of lavender and old books. "I have been waiting years for someone in this family to do something truly interesting. and you have exceeded all my expectations magnificently." Eleanor found herself laughing for the first time since the wedding, a sound that startled her with its unfamiliarity, and she allowed herself to be drawn into the cottage's warm chaos of mismatched furniture and towering bookstacks and windows that looked out over a garden gone beautifully wild. Over tea served in chipped cups that had once belonged to a countess, Aunt Beatrice told Eleanor the story she had never heard, how 40 years ago she had refused to marry the Viscount her father had chosen, had thrown a glass of wine in his face when he tried to kiss her without permission, and had been sent to this very cottage in disgrace. "I never left," Aunt Beatrice said with a smile that held no regret. "I discovered I rather preferred my own company to the suffocating performance of society. And your uncle, God rest him, found me here 10 years later and loved me precisely because I was ungovernable." That night Eleanor began a journal, the first entry written by candlelight while Wellington purred at her feet, and she found herself pouring onto the page all the things she had never permitted herself to feel, the rage and the relief and the strange hollow ache of not knowing whether she had destroyed her life or finally begun to live it. It was 3 days later that Aunt Beatrice mentioned, with studied casualness over breakfast, that a most peculiar letter had arrived for Eleanor's father shortly after the wedding, from the Duke of Somerton himself, and that her brother had written to say the Duke had not spoken publicly of the slap at all, which was, Aunt Beatrice observed with a knowing gleam in her eye, either very ominous or very interesting indeed. June 29th, 1814. And the late afternoon light fell golden across the cottage garden where Eleanor sat among the wild roses with her journal open on her lap, the words she had written that morning still drying on the page as she tried to capture the strange peace that had begun to settle into her bones after 2 weeks of exile. She had just set down her pen when Aunt Beatrice appeared at the garden gate with Wellington draped across her shoulders and 2 letters clutched in her ink-stained fingers, her expression one of barely contained delight that immediately set Eleanor's nerves on edge. "One from your father," Aunt Beatrice announced, "and one that came enclosed within it, sealed with a crest I recognize rather well, a raven clutching a rose in its talons. The arms of the Duke of Somerton." Eleanor's hand trembled as she took the letters, and she noticed how the Duke's seal had been pressed deep into burgundy wax with the kind of deliberate care that suggested the sender had wanted to make an impression. Her father's note was brief and bewildered, stating only that the enclosed letter had arrived at the London house with a request that it be forwarded to Eleanor immediately, and that he could not fathom what his Grace could possibly want, but felt obligated to comply, given that the Duke had, inexplicably, not spoken publicly of the incident at the wedding, and had in fact deflected all inquiries with a curt observation that what passed between himself and Miss Ashworth was a private matter. Eleanor broke the Ravenscroft seal with fingers that felt oddly numb, and unfolded the heavy cream paper to find a hand that was bold and angular and somehow exactly what she would have expected from the man who had spoken those cruel words in the rose garden. "Miss Ashworth," the letter began, "I find myself in the unprecedented position of composing an apology for words I spoke without thought and cruelty I dispensed without cause, which is to say I have written and discarded 7 versions of this letter, and none of them have adequately expressed the depth of my regret for what I said about you at your sister's wedding. The words I used were unforgivable, born of my own bitter discontent, and directed at you for no reason other than that you were present, and I was determined to find fault with something. Your response, while shocking, was entirely warranted, and I have spent the past 2 weeks examining why a single slap from a woman I had wronged so grievously has unsettled me more than any event in recent memory. I write not to excuse my behavior, for there is no excuse, but to request the opportunity to apologize to you in person, to look you in the eye and acknowledge the harm I caused. I ask your permission to call upon you at your aunt's residence in Somerset. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding with an emotion she could not name, something between fury and bewilderment and a dangerous flicker of curiosity. "How delicious," Aunt Beatrice murmured, reading over her shoulder without apology. "What will you tell him?" Eleanor folded the letter with deliberate care and spoke the only word that made sense. "No. July 6th, 1814, and the midday sun blazed down upon the cottage garden with an intensity that seemed almost personal, as if summer itself had decided to bear witness to what was about to unfold, when Eleanor heard the unmistakable sound of hooves on the lane and looked up from her book to see a magnificent black stallion approaching, its rider instantly recognizable even at a distance by the rigid set of his shoulders and the dark coat that seemed absurdly formal for a country visit. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand, her heart hammering with an emotion that was mostly fury, but threaded through with something else she refused to examine. And she watched the Duke of Somerton dismount with the easy grace of a man who had been riding since childhood, watched him tie his horse to the garden gate with hands that bore calluses she had not expected, watched him turn toward the cottage with an expression that might have been determination, or might have been something closer to desperation. "I said no," Eleanor declared before he had taken 3 steps toward her, the words sharp enough to make him pause mid-stride. "I refused your request to call, and yet here you stand as if my answer were merely a suggestion to be discarded at your convenience." Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, had the grace to look momentarily uncertain, a crack in the cold facade she remembered from the wedding. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than she remembered, rougher around the edges. "I am aware that my presence is unwelcome," he said, "but I could not content myself with a written apology when what I said to you deserves to be atoned for face to face, and so I have come prepared to be turned away if you insist upon it, but also prepared to stay until you have heard what I came to say." Eleanor noticed that he carried something beneath his arm, a book bound in green leather that she recognized with a jolt as the treatise on astronomy she had mentioned wanting in a letter to Charlotte months ago, a detail so specific and so impossible that she found herself momentarily speechless. Aunt Beatrice had conveniently disappeared that morning with vague murmurs about visiting a neighbor, leaving Eleanor alone to face this man whose signet ring caught the sunlight as he extended the book toward her like a peace offering set at the feet of an enemy bed. "I spoke cruelly at your sister's wedding," Frederick continued when she did not take the book, "and I have spent 3 weeks trying to understand why I did so, why I looked at a woman I did not know and chose to wound her with words designed to draw blood." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had carefully constructed beginning to show hairline fractures, and against every instinct that screamed at her to send him away, she found herself saying the words that would change everything. "You have 10 minutes," she told him, stepping back to allow him entry to the cottage parlor. "And then you will leave and never return." The 10 minutes stretched into 20, and then into an hour, and still Eleanor found herself seated across from Frederick Ravenscroft in Aunt Beatrice's modest parlor, listening to words she had never expected to hear from a man of his position and reputation. He spoke of the pressure that had descended upon him since his wife's death 3 years prior, the relentless parade of suitable young ladies thrust before him at every gathering, the whispered speculations about whether the Duke of Somerton would ever produce an heir, and how he had armored himself in coldness because it was easier to be cruel than to be vulnerable. "I married Catherine when I was 22, Frederick said, his voice dropping to something rough and unfamiliar. "And I did so because my father had arranged it, and I believed duty was the highest calling a man could answer. She was kind and gentle and deserved far better than a husband who did not love her, and when she died bringing our son into the world, a son who lived only 3 hours, I told myself I would never again allow anyone close enough to wound me. Eleanor felt the anger that had sustained her through 3 weeks of exile begin to transform into something more complicated, something that frightened her far more than rage ever had. The afternoon light was fading when Frederick suggested they walk, and she agreed before she could think better of it, leading him through the cottage garden and into the meadow beyond where the Somerset countryside rolled golden and green toward the distant hills. They walked in silence at first, past the wild roses that tumbled over the old stone wall, past the spot where Eleanor had been sitting when his letter arrived, until they reached a massive oak tree whose branches spread wide enough to shelter a small army from rain or sun. "This is where I come to read," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the confession, and Frederick looked at the tree and then at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "I noticed your journal," he said. "When you let me into the parlor, you had it tucked under your arm as if it were something precious, and I found myself wondering what thoughts you commit to those pages, what observations about the world you consider worth preserving." Eleanor studied his hands as he spoke, noting again the calluses she had observed earlier, the evidence that this duke did not merely sit in drawing rooms and issue orders, but actually worked with his hands in some capacity. The sunset was beginning to paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, colors that seemed to set the clouds ablaze, and when Frederick turned to face her fully, his eyes held none of the cold disdain she remembered from the wedding. "May I call upon you again?" he asked, properly this time, with your permission granted rather than your refusal ignored, and Eleanor heard herself speak words that would alter the course of her life. "I will consider it," she said, and watched something that looked remarkably like hope flicker across his features before he schooled his expression back to careful neutrality and bowed over her hand with a formality that felt almost tender. The visits began on July 13th, 1814, when Frederick arrived at the cottage carrying a worn copy of Wollstonecraft that he claimed to have discovered in his library and thought she might find interesting, and Eleanor accepted it with hands that trembled only slightly, telling herself that one more conversation could do no harm when she had already survived so much harm in her 26 years. They sat in Aunt Beatrice's parlor that first proper visit, the windows thrown open to catch whatever breeze the July heat might offer, and they spoke of the book he had brought, of the arguments within its pages that Eleanor had long believed but never dared voice in polite company, and when she offered an opinion that would have scandalized her mother. Frederick leaned forward with genuine interest rather than the horrified recoil she had learned to expect from gentlemen of his station. He returned on July 15th with questions about what she had been reading before he interrupted her exile, and she found herself confessing her love of astronomy, of the way the night sky made her feel both infinitely small and somehow significant, and he listened as if her words were worth remembering. By July 18th, they had established a pattern without acknowledging they were doing so, meeting beneath the great oak tree where the shade offered respite from the relentless summer sun, and there they would sit for hours debating philosophy and literature and politics, while Aunt Beatrice watched from her window with an expression that suggested she was enjoying herself immensely. Frederick brought roses on July 20th, cut from his own estate's garden, and Eleanor accepted them with a confusion that bordered on pain because no one had ever brought her flowers before, not in 5 seasons, not once, and she did not know how to hold something so beautiful without fearing it would be snatched away. The peaches were ripening in the cottage orchard by July 24th, and Frederick helped her pick them, his coat discarded over a branch, his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms that spoke of physical labor rather than idle aristocratic leisure. And when their fingers brushed reaching for the same fruit, Eleanor felt her careful skepticism crack like sun-dried earth, desperate for rain. She laughed on July 27th, truly laughed, at something clever he said about a pompous poet they both despised, and the sound surprised her so much that she fell silent immediately. but Frederick looked at her as though she had given him a gift beyond measure. Aunt Beatrice remarked that evening that the Duke seemed quite different from the cold creature society described, and Eleanor replied that society was often wrong about people, and her aunt smiled in a way that suggested she knew exactly what was happening, even if Eleanor herself refused to name it. The books accumulated on Eleanor's nightstand, volumes borrowed and exchanged, their margins sometimes marked with notes in his hand that felt like secret correspondence, and she began to suspect that word of these visits would eventually reach London, that the gossips would feast upon this strange development. But increasingly she found she did not care, or perhaps more accurately she found that caring seemed less important than the way Frederick asked her opinion and actually listened to her answer. The morning of August 1st, 1814, began with bird song and the gentle clatter of Aunt Beatrice preparing breakfast in the kitchen below, sounds that had become as familiar and comforting to Eleanor as her own heartbeat over the weeks of her exile. But the peace shattered the moment the post arrived, and she recognized her mother's handwriting on the first letter, the loops and flourishes conveying agitation even before Eleanor broke the seal and began to read the frantic words within. Lady Margaret Ashworth wrote of rumours that had reached London like wildfire consuming dry brush, whispers in every drawing-room and at every card-table about the Duke of Somerton making repeated visits to a certain cottage in Somerset, where a certain disgraced young woman happened to be residing. And what precisely was Eleanor thinking, encouraging such attention from a man she had publicly assaulted? And did she not understand that society was divided between those who believed the Duke was exacting some elaborate revenge and those who were convinced he had simply lost his mind? Eleanor's hands trembled as she set aside her mother's letter and reached for the second envelope, this one on the distinctive cream paper with pressed violet edges that Charlotte Sinclair had used for their correspondence since they were girls of 16 sharing secrets in school. And Charlotte's words were gentler, but no less alarming, as she reported that Lydia was telling anyone who would listen that her sister had clearly bewitched the Duke through some improper means, that the timing of his visits could not be coincidental, that he must be toying with Eleanor as punishment for the humiliation she had inflicted upon him at the wedding. The breakfast that Aunt Beatrice had prepared sat untouched on Eleanor's plate as the morning stretched toward noon, the eggs growing cold, the toast hardening, while Eleanor sat motionless at the small table in the breakfast room and felt the fragile happiness she had been nurturing over the past weeks begin to crack like ice beneath too much weight. She heard Frederick arrive before she saw him, the familiar sound of Caesar's hooves on the path, and when he entered the cottage and found her in the breakfast room, his expression shifted from anticipation to concern in the space of a single breath. The letters lay scattered on the table before her, evidence of the outside world that had finally broken through the sanctuary they had created. And Frederick did not need to read them to understand what had happened, because he had surely received his own correspondence, his own warnings from well-meaning friends or opportunistic gossips eager to be the first to inform him that all of London was talking. Eleanor looked up at him, at this man who had become something she never expected over the course of 6 weeks, and the question that had been building inside her since she read her mother's accusations finally broke free with a rawness that surprised them both. "What is this?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fear beneath it. "What are we doing? What do you want from me? Because I find I cannot endure another moment of uncertainty when the entire world seems convinced they know your intentions better than I do." Frederick did not answer immediately, and in the silence Eleanor felt every fear she had ever harbored about herself rise up like floodwaters, threatening to drown whatever fragile hope had taken root in her heart over these impossible weeks. The rain began then, fat drops striking the windows with increasing urgency, and the sound transported her instantly back to that carriage ride on June 15th, when the storm had broken and her life had shattered. and she wondered if storms would always mark the turning points of her existence. Frederick moved toward the window, his back to her for a long moment, and when he turned, his face was stripped of the careful composure she had come to associate with him, revealing something raw and uncertain beneath. "Is this guilt?" Eleanor continued, her voice stronger now because she had spent 26 years learning to speak through fear. "Is this curiosity about the woman mad enough to strike a duke? Is this some elaborate game I am too foolish to understand? Because I find I would rather know the worst now than discover it later when I have allowed myself to believe in something that was never real." Frederick crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped before her, close enough that she could see his hands trembling slightly at his sides, close enough that she noticed for the first time the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You want to know what this is?" he said, his voice rough in a way she had never heard it. "Then I will tell you, though I have spent weeks trying to find words adequate to the task and failing utterly. This is the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced, and I have buried a wife and a child who never drew breath. I have inherited a dukedom I never wanted. I have spent 3 years building walls so high I thought no one would ever scale them. You did not scale them, Eleanor. You demolished them with a single blow on a hot afternoon in June, and I have been trying to understand what happened to me ever since." He reached for her hands then, the worn copy of Wollstonecraft pressed between her fingers, the book he had brought that first day as a peace offering, and his grip was firm but gentle. "I knew in that moment," he continued, "when you stood before me with fire in your eyes and your palm still stinging from the contact, I knew that you were the first genuine person I had encountered in years, perhaps in my entire life, someone who would not simper or flatter or pretend, someone who saw through every mask I wore and found me wanting and was brave enough to show it." The lightning flashed then, illuminating his face in stark white relief, and Eleanor saw that his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, though she could not quite believe it. "I am asking permission to court you formally," he said, "to write to your father, to tell the world that the woman who slapped me is the woman I intend to marry if she will have me. Not because I feel guilt or curiosity or whim, but because you have made me remember what it feels like to be alive." The carriage wheels crunched along the gravel drive of Ravenscroft Manor on the morning of August the 10th, 1814. And Eleanor pressed her gloved hands together in her lap to stop their trembling as the estate revealed itself through the window in all its imposing grandeur, a sprawling edifice of honey-colored stone that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the late summer sky, its windows glinting like watchful eyes in the midday sun. Frederick had described his home to her during their weeks of conversation beneath the oak tree, but words had failed to capture the sheer magnitude of what would become her world if she accepted the future he was offering, and Eleanor felt suddenly very small in her modest traveling dress, very aware that she was a baronet's daughter approaching the ancestral seat of one of England's oldest dukedoms. Frederick rode beside the carriage on Caesar's gleaming black back, and when they drew to a stop before the great doors, he was there before the footman could reach her, his hand extended to help her down, his eyes searching her face for signs of the fear she was desperately trying to hide. The entrance hall alone could have swallowed Aunt Beatrice's cottage whole, with its soaring ceilings painted with scenes of classical mythology and its marble floors worn smooth by generations of Ravenscroft footsteps, and Eleanor caught herself cataloguing escape routes before she remembered that she was not here as a prisoner but as an honored guest, as the woman the Duke of Somerton intended to marry. She noticed the portrait as Frederick guided her toward the drawing-room, a beautiful dark-haired woman captured in oils and gilt, and she felt rather than saw Frederick's hand tighten at her elbow as he steered her past without comment, though Eleanor understood immediately who the woman must have been and what it cost him to walk these halls where her memory lingered in every corner. The Dowager Duchess awaited them in a sunlit parlor, seated in a chair that might as well have been a throne, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her posture rigid with the kind of aristocratic bearing that Eleanor's mother had spent years unsuccessfully trying to instill in her daughters. The brooch at the dowager's throat was magnificent, a cluster of sapphires and diamonds that caught the light as she turned her assessing gaze upon Eleanor. And in that gaze, Eleanor recognized something familiar. The same measuring look she had endured from every patroness at Almack's, every hostess who had deemed her unworthy of a second glance. Tea was served with excruciating formality, while the dowager made observations that were technically polite but edged with frost, remarking on Eleanor's modest family connections, her advanced age of 26, her notorious reputation following that unfortunate incident at her sister's wedding, and Eleanor felt Frederick growing tense beside her with each barely veiled slight. But Eleanor had not survived 5 seasons of dismissal and disappointment to crumble now before one imperious woman, however powerful, and when the dowager asked pointedly whether Eleanor truly believed herself suited to become a duchess, Eleanor met her eyes steadily and replied that she believed herself suited to make Frederick happy, which was rather the more important question. The dowager's eyebrows rose fractionally at this response, and in the silence that followed, Frederick reached over and took Eleanor's hand in full view of his mother, his grip warm and proud and utterly unashamed. Later, when he walked her through the library that would become her sanctuary, he apologized for his mother's coldness, but Eleanor simply smiled and told him she had faced worse, and meant it completely. The Dowager Duchess sent word on the morning of August 17th that she wished to take tea with Eleanor in the garden, alone, and though the message was phrased as an invitation, Eleanor understood it for what it truly was, a summons to face judgment without Frederick's protective presence to shield her from whatever barbs his mother chose to deploy. Eleanor dressed carefully in a morning gown of soft green that Aunt Beatrice had helped her select, modest enough to avoid accusations of presumption, yet well cut enough to demonstrate she understood the standards expected of a future duchess, and she walked through the manor's corridors with her chin held high, even as her stomach churned with apprehension. The garden was spectacular in the August heat, roses blooming in profusion along carefully manicured paths, their fragrance heavy in the warm air, and Eleanor found the dowager seated beneath a latticed arbor with the tea service already arranged on the small table before her, the sapphire and diamond brooch glinting at her throat like a challenge. "You will sit," the dowager said without preamble, gesturing to the chair opposite, "and we will speak plainly to one another without my son hovering about like a worried nursemaid, because I find I have questions that require honest answers, and I suspect you are capable of providing them if you choose." Eleanor sat and accepted the cup of tea the dowager poured, noting the distinctive amber color and rich aroma of what she would later learn was a blend specially imported for the family, and she met the older woman's gaze steadily as the interrogation began. The dowager asked about the slap first, her voice deceptively mild, wanting to know whether Eleanor regretted the scandal she had caused or merely regretted being caught, and Eleanor replied that she regretted nothing except perhaps not striking harder, which earned her a sharp look, followed by something that might have been reluctant approval. The questions continued relentlessly, probing Eleanor's family circumstances, her education, her expectations, her understanding of what it meant to become a duchess. And Eleanor answered each one truthfully, refusing to embellish her modest background or pretend to qualifications she did not possess. Through the arbor's lattice, Eleanor could see Frederick pacing before the library windows, his anxiety visible even at this distance, and the sight of his worry for her gave her courage to continue facing his mother's scrutiny without flinching. Then the dowager's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something softening behind her eyes, and she set down her teacup with deliberate care before speaking again. "I was 18 when I fell in love with a naval officer," she said quietly, her voice losing its cutting edge. "A man of no fortune and no connections who made me laugh in ways I had never laughed before, and I chose duty over my heart, because that was what women of my station did, and I have spent 40 years wondering what my life might have been if I had possessed even a fraction of your courage." The admission hung between them in the rose-scented air, and when Eleanor reached across the table to touch the dowager's hand, the older woman did not pull away. "My son deserves someone who will love him fiercely enough to fight for him," the dowager continued, "and I believe you might be that person. Heaven help us all." The morning of September 1st, 1814, dawned with the first hints of autumn in the air, the leaves along the Somerset roads beginning to show edges of gold and copper as Eleanor's carriage made its way toward London. And she found herself pressing her palm against the window glass, as if she might absorb some of the countryside's peace before facing the city that had witnessed her disgrace less than 3 months prior. Frederick rode Caesar alongside the carriage for the first several hours of the journey, his presence visible through the window a constant reassurance, and when they stopped to rest the horses at a coaching inn, he handed her down with such tender care that the innkeeper's wife whispered to her husband about young love, not knowing she spoke of a duke and the woman who had slapped him at a wedding. The landscape shifted as they travelled, the wild roses and rambling hedgerows of Somerset giving way to more ordered fields, and eventually to the spreading outskirts of the city itself. And Eleanor felt her chest tighten with each mile that brought her closer to the world that had dismissed her for so long, the world she must now face as the acknowledged choice of one of England's most powerful men. Frederick had turned back at the halfway point, pressing a kiss to her gloved hand and promising to call first thing in the morning, and his absence left the carriage feeling emptier than it had any right to feel after only 2 months of knowing him. The Ashworth townhouse looked smaller than Eleanor remembered when the carriage finally rolled to a stop before it, the modest facade a stark contrast to Ravenscroft Manor's grandeur, and she found herself cataloguing the peeling paint on the window frames and the slightly overgrown front garden with new eyes that made her feel both disloyal and honest. Her mother waited in the front parlour with her father and Lydia, the latter having arrived from her own London residence with what she claimed was sisterly concern, but what Eleanor recognised immediately as a need to witness whatever disaster might unfold. Lady Margaret embraced Eleanor with nervous energy, her hands fluttering as she spoke of society's long memory and the importance of perfect comportment, while Sir Thomas simply squeezed his eldest daughter's shoulder and told her quietly that he was proud of her, words so unexpected that Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. Lydia sat in the corner, looking thinner than she had at her wedding, shadows beneath her eyes that her artfully applied powder could not quite conceal, and when she remarked that Eleanor must be quite pleased with herself for catching a duke through scandal, their mother actually told her to hold her tongue, a reversal that left both sisters momentarily speechless. That evening, as Eleanor unpacked her trunk in her childhood bedroom, her fingers brushed against the pale lavender dress she had worn on the day everything changed, and she wondered if she might wear it again as a kind of armour, a reminder to herself and to London that she was not ashamed of who she had been or who she had become. The note arrived just before dinner, carried by a footman in Ravenscroft livery, and Eleanor broke the familiar seal with hands that trembled only slightly as she read the words that would carry her through the sleepless night ahead. "Tomorrow we face them together," Frederick had written, "and whatever comes, know that I am proud to stand beside you." The evening of September 3rd, 1814 arrived with the weight of 1,000 judgments pressing against Eleanor's chest as she stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom, watching her mother's maid fasten the last of the tiny buttons along the back of a gown the color of midnight sky, a deep, rich blue that Frederick had sent to the house that very morning, with a note declaring it her color, the shade of twilight when day surrenders to mystery. And though Eleanor had protested the extravagance, she could not deny that the silk transformed her in ways she had never experienced during 5 seasons of wearing pastels chosen to help her fade into wallpaper. Frederick's carriage arrived precisely at 7, the Ravenscroft crest gleaming on the door in the lamplight, and when he handed her up into the velvet interior, his fingers lingered on hers a moment longer than propriety allowed, his eyes traveling over her appearance with an expression that made her feel, for perhaps the first time in her life, genuinely beautiful. The journey to the Royal Opera House passed in a blur of Frederick's reassurances and Eleanor's determined deep breathing, and when the carriage finally stopped and the door opened to reveal the gathered crowd of London's elite ascending the grand steps, Eleanor felt her courage waver like a candle flame in a draught. Frederick descended first and turned to hand her down, and in that moment when her gloved fingers met his and she stepped onto the pavement with all of fashionable London watching, she heard the whispers begin like leaves rustling before a storm, her name passing from lip to ear alongside words like scandal and slap and impossible. She lifted her chin and placed her hand on Frederick's offered arm, feeling the solid strength of him beside her as they began the long walk up the steps, and his free hand came to rest at the small of her waist in a gesture of possession and protection that sent another wave of whispers rippling through the crowd. The foyer was worse, the enclosed space trapping the murmurs and magnifying them until Eleanor could make out individual voices. And then she heard it, that distinctive sharp laugh that had haunted her through countless ballrooms, the laugh of Lady Hastings, who had once declared within Eleanor's hearing that the Ashworth spinster should simply retire to the country and stop cluttering up the marriage mart. Lady Hastings approached with her entourage of similarly sharp-tongued matrons, and Eleanor braced herself as the woman drew near. But instead of the greeting demanded by basic civility, Lady Hastings looked directly through Eleanor as if she were made of glass, executing a cut direct so blatant that gasps echoed through the foyer. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats before Frederick spoke, his voice carrying with aristocratic precision designed to reach every listening ear. "Lady Hastings," he said with ice dripping from each syllable, "I see your manners remain as deficient as your judgment, and I shall be certain to remember this moment when your daughter requires an advantageous match next season." Lady Hastings went pale, and Eleanor stood tall despite her trembling hands, and Frederick guided her forward into the opera house proper as the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses. The afternoon of September the 10th, 1814, brought Eleanor to Lady Sinclair's garden party beneath a sky of perfect autumn blue, the roses still blooming in defiant abundance despite the season's turn. And as she passed through the wrought iron gates on Frederick's arm, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, though this time the whispers carried a different quality than they had at the opera just 1 week before. Charlotte Sinclair, resplendent in her signature yellow silk, broke from a cluster of young ladies and crossed the lawn with unladylike haste to embrace Eleanor with genuine warmth that brought tears to both their eyes, and when she pulled back to examine her friend's face, she declared loudly enough for nearby guests to hear that Eleanor looked positively radiant, and that Somerset air clearly agreed with her constitution. The women who had ignored Eleanor for 5 seasons now approached with smiles that did not quite reach their eyes, complimenting her gown and inquiring about her health with solicitude that rang hollow to ears trained by years of their indifference, and Eleanor accepted their attention with gracious composure while recognizing it for what it was, not genuine regard, but fear of offending the Duke of Somerton, whose cold reputation made him a dangerous enemy. Frederick remained close throughout the afternoon, his hand finding the small of her back whenever the crowd pressed near, his eyes meeting hers across conversations with a warmth that made her heart stutter despite the performative nature of the gathering around them. And when he finally drew her aside to a quiet corner near a particularly magnificent rose arbor, he studied her face with that intensity she had come to recognize as his truest form of attention. "Are you happy?" he asked simply. And Eleanor considered the question with the honesty their relationship had been built upon, admitting that she saw through the false courtesy, but found she minded less than she had expected, because the only opinions that truly mattered to her now were his and Charlotte's and her own. Frederick's smile transformed his stern features into something approaching boyish delight, and he was leaning closer to speak. Words meant only for her ears when a familiar voice cut through the garden party's pleasant murmur, and Eleanor turned to find Lydia approaching with Lord Greville, trailing several paces behind, looking bored and faintly irritated. Her sister's beauty remained undimmed, but something essential had faded behind her eyes. The shadows Eleanor had noticed at their parents' house now deeper, despite the careful application of powder and rouge. And Lydia's smile when she greeted Eleanor carried an edge of desperation beneath its brittle brightness. "How wonderful that you have found such an advantageous situation," Lydia said with sweetness that did not mask the bitterness beneath. And Eleanor felt Frederick stiffen beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm to still whatever cutting response he might have offered, recognizing in her sister's pinched expression not malice, but misery, the dawning realization that beauty alone could not guarantee happiness, and that the marriage she had rushed into for status had delivered far less than she had imagined. The evening following the garden party found Eleanor alone in her family's modest drawing room, the September twilight casting long shadows across the worn carpet as she reflected on the afternoon's encounters, and particularly on the haunted look in Lydia's eyes that had followed her through the carriage ride home and into her restless thoughts. She had expected to feel triumph at her sister's evident unhappiness, some vindication for years of being compared unfavorably to Lydia's golden beauty. But instead Eleanor discovered only a heavy sadness settling in her chest as she remembered how young 19 truly was, and how Lydia had been encouraged by their mother to value nothing beyond her appearance and advantageous marriage. A knock at the door interrupted her melancholy contemplation, and before Eleanor could respond, Lydia slipped into the room with an expression so stripped of its usual artifice that Eleanor barely recognized her sister beneath the vulnerability now displayed without mask or pretense. "I need to speak with you," Lydia said in a voice roughened by what Eleanor suspected were recent tears, and she lowered herself onto the settee beside Eleanor with none of her customary attention to the arrangement of her skirts. What followed was a confession that unraveled nearly 3 months of sisterly distance as Lydia admitted that her marriage to Lord Greville had proven hollow within weeks, that he found her conversation tedious and her accomplishments insufficient, that he had already begun spending his evenings at his club or with companions he did not name, while she sat alone in their grand townhouse, wondering how beauty had failed to guarantee the happiness she had been promised it would bring. Eleanor listened without interruption, as her sister's words tumbled forth like water breaking through a dam. And when Lydia finally fell silent, Eleanor reached across the space between them to take her sister's hand in her own, feeling the trembling of fingers that had once gestured so carelessly toward Eleanor's inferior prospects. "I was cruel to you," Lydia whispered, "and I told myself you deserved it because you were clever and I was only pretty, and somehow that seemed unfair, though I know now it was I who had every advantage society could offer." Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand and spoke carefully of how they had both been shaped by expectations neither had chosen, how their mother had taught them to see each other as rivals rather than allies, and how perhaps it was not too late to become the sisters they might have been had circumstances been different. They talked until the candles burned low and the tea grew cold, and when Lydia finally rose to leave, she embraced Eleanor with genuine affection that felt foreign and precious simultaneously, promising to call again soon, not as the triumphant beauty visiting the spinster sister, but simply as Lydia seeking Eleanor. After her sister departed, Eleanor sat in the gathering darkness, feeling something shift within her heart, a releasing of old resentments she had not realized she still carried. And when Frederick's card arrived the next morning requesting permission to call that afternoon, she found herself eager to share this unexpected reconciliation with the man who had taught her that people could change and grow beyond the roles society assigned them. Frederick arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as his card had promised, and Eleanor received him in the drawing-room where she had sat with Lydia the previous evening, the space somehow transformed by morning light and the lingering sense of reconciliation that still warmed her thoughts. He noticed immediately that something had shifted within her, his perceptive gaze cataloguing the softness around her eyes and the way she smiled when she greeted him with a warmth less guarded than even the day before. And when he inquired about the change, she found herself telling him everything about Lydia's visit, about the confession and the tears and the tentative bridge now being built between sisters who had spent years as strangers sharing the same blood. Frederick listened with that particular stillness he adopted when giving someone his complete attention, and when Eleanor finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment before observing that she continued to surprise him with her capacity for forgiveness, for seeing beyond the surface of people to the wounded hearts beneath their brittle performances. "I learned it from watching you," Eleanor replied, remembering the cold duke she had slapped in a rose garden and the vulnerable man who had emerged through weeks of honest conversation, and Frederick's expression shifted into something so tender that her breath caught in her throat. He rose from his chair and crossed the modest distance between them, taking her hands in his as he had begun doing more frequently, his thumbs tracing gentle circles across her knuckles, while he spoke of matters he had been contemplating since watching her navigate Lady Sinclair's garden party with such grace. "I have waited," he said carefully, "because I wanted you to be certain, wanted you to see that society would accept you before I bound you to a life that would require facing them always at my side. But I find I cannot wait any longer to ask what I have wished to ask since that afternoon in my mother's garden when you refused to be anything other than exactly who you are." Eleanor's heart began racing as Frederick lowered himself to one knee on the worn carpet that had witnessed so many years of her quiet disappointment, his hands still holding hers, his eyes never leaving her face, as he spoke words that seemed to reshape the very air around them. "Miss Ashworth," he began, then paused and shook his head slightly before beginning again with a faint smile. "Eleanor, I have spent 32 years believing that duty and happiness were separate concerns never meant to intersect, but you have shown me that honor and love can occupy the same heart, that strength and tenderness need not be enemies." He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a ring that caught the afternoon light filtering through the windows, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that seemed to hold the same deep blue as the dress he had chosen for her to wear to the opera. "Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the slight trembling Eleanor could feel in the hand still clasping hers. And in that moment all the years of rejection and invisibility and quiet resignation seemed to fall away like leaves released by an autumn wind, leaving only this man kneeling before her, with hope and fear mingling in his expression. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, then repeated the word more strongly as joy flooded through her with an intensity that brought tears to her eyes. "Yes, Frederick, yes." The ring slid onto her finger as though it had been crafted for her alone, the sapphire catching the afternoon light and scattering tiny fragments of blue across the worn carpet of the drawing room where Eleanor had spent so many years invisible and overlooked, and Frederick rose from his knee to cup her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall despite her attempts to contain them. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, a promise sealed against her lips that tasted of hope and futures. She had long ago stopped imagining for herself, and when he drew back, his own eyes glistened with emotion that the cold duke of her first acquaintance would never have permitted anyone to witness. "I must speak with your father," Frederick said, his voice rough with feeling. And Eleanor laughed through her tears at the absurdity of formal propriety after everything they had already weathered together. But she nodded and squeezed his hands before releasing him to find Sir Thomas in his study. The hour that followed passed in a blur of congratulations, and her mother's tearful exclamations, and her father's gruff but genuine pleasure, and through it all, Eleanor felt as though she were watching herself from a great distance, the spinster sister transformed into a future duchess by the alchemy of love that had seemed impossibly beyond her reach only 3 months before. That evening Frederick dined with her family, and Eleanor observed how naturally he conversed with her father about estate management, how patiently he endured her mother's effusive gratitude, how carefully he included Lydia in the conversation, despite the younger sister's obvious struggle to mask her complicated feelings about this reversal of their fortunes. When he departed, he pressed a kiss to Eleanor's hand that lingered long enough to send warmth flooding through her, and his whispered promise to call first thing in the morning echoed in her thoughts as she lay awake that night, watching moonlight play across the sapphire on her finger. The following days brought a flurry of activity as the announcement was prepared for the papers, and Eleanor found herself surrounded by modistes and milliners and her mother's endless opinions about wedding breakfasts and trousseau items and the 1,000 small details that accompanied the transformation of Miss Ashworth into Her Grace the Duchess of Somerton. Charlotte arrived with champagne and genuine delight, embracing Eleanor fiercely and declaring that she had known from the moment she saw Frederick defend Eleanor at the opera that this man understood her friend's worth in ways that others had failed to perceive for 26 years. Even the Dowager Duchess sent a note of formal congratulations that contained, Eleanor noticed with quiet satisfaction, a postscript inviting her to tea so they might discuss arrangements together. The sapphire brooch she had worn at their first meeting now offered as a wedding gift. Frederick visited every day without exception, sometimes for hours and sometimes for stolen minutes between other obligations, and each visit left Eleanor more certain that this happiness she had stumbled into through scandal and defiance was real and solid and hers to keep. September ripened toward October, the leaves turning gold and crimson outside her window, and Eleanor Ashworth counted the days until she would become Frederick's wife, until the woman who had slapped a duke at her sister's wedding would stand before God and society and claim him as her own, until all the years of invisibility would finally fade into a past she could regard with gratitude for having shaped her into someone worthy of being truly seen. The wedding of Miss Eleanor Ashworth to His Grace, Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, took place on September 15th, 1814, exactly 3 months after the infamous slap that had scandalized London society and set into motion a love story that would be whispered about in drawing rooms for generations to come. The morning dawned crisp and golden, autumn light streaming through the windows of the Ashworth townhouse as Eleanor sat before her mirror while her mother fussed with the delicate lace of her veil and Charlotte arranged the final pins in her hair, and Eleanor found herself thinking not of the grandeur awaiting her at St. George's, Hanover Square, but of a small cottage in Somerset, where a determined duke had refused to accept her refusal, and in doing so had changed the entire trajectory of her existence. Her gown was ivory silk trimmed with seed pearls, elegant without ostentation, chosen not to compete with Lydia's elaborate confection from 3 months prior, but to reflect the quiet dignity that Frederick had told her he admired above all her qualities, and at her throat she wore a single sapphire pendant that matched her engagement ring. A gift from the Dowager Duchess that had arrived with a note declaring Eleanor a worthy addition to the Ravenscroft legacy. The church was filled beyond capacity with the cream of society, many of whom had cut Eleanor directly only weeks before, and now jostled for positions close enough to witness the Duke claim his unconventional bride. And Eleanor felt their eyes upon her as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. But the weight of their scrutiny no longer pressed upon her chest as it once had, because at the altar stood Frederick, his eyes fixed upon her with an expression of such unguarded adoration that nothing else in the world seemed to matter. He took her hand when she reached him, his fingers warm and steady around hers. And as the Archbishop began the ancient words that would bind them together, Eleanor heard Frederick whisper something meant for her alone. Worth every scandal, worth every whisper, worth everything. The ceremony passed in a blur of sacred vows and golden light, of Frederick's voice strong and certain as he pledged himself to her, of her own voice steadier than she had expected as she promised to love and honor this man who had seen her truly when the rest of the world had looked past her for 26 years, and when he slid the wedding band onto her finger beside the sapphire engagement ring, Eleanor felt something shift within her, a final releasing of the resigned spinster she had believed herself destined to remain forever. Frederick kissed her when given permission, tender and brief, but containing a promise of deeper intimacies to come. And when they turned to face the congregation as the Duke and Duchess of Somerton, the applause that rose felt less like society's approval and more like a surrender to a love story that had refused to follow any of their prescribed rules. They walked back down the aisle together, Eleanor's hand tucked securely in the crook of Frederick's arm, and she caught Lydia's eye in the crowd, her sister's expression complicated, but not unkind, a small nod passing between them that acknowledged how thoroughly their positions had reversed and how much they both had learned about the unpredictable nature of happiness. The wedding breakfast at Ravenscroft Manor unfolded in a splendor that Eleanor could scarcely have imagined during those long years of sitting along ballroom walls watching other women celebrate matches she had been told were forever beyond her reach. And as she took her place beside Frederick at the head of the long table, adorned with autumn roses and flickering candles, she felt the curious sensation of inhabiting a life that fit her perfectly, despite being nothing she had planned or expected. Frederick's hand found hers beneath the damask tablecloth, his thumb tracing circles against her palm while toast after toast rose in their honor, and Eleanor caught the Dowager Duchess watching them from her place of honor with an expression that had softened considerably from their first tense meeting. The sapphire brooch at her throat glinting in the candlelight as she raised her own glass to the union she had initially viewed with such skepticism. Charlotte sat beaming beside her mother, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and mouthing words of joy across the table whenever Eleanor's gaze met hers, and even Sir Thomas appeared moved beyond his usual reserve, clearing his throat repeatedly as he watched his eldest daughter transformed from overlooked spinster to one of the highest-ranking women in the realm. The meal progressed through course after course of delicacies that Eleanor barely tasted. So absorbed was she in the simple miracle of Frederick's presence beside her, in the way he leaned close to whisper private observations about their guests that made her suppress laughter, in the absolute certainty in his eyes whenever he looked at her that she was exactly where she belonged. When the dancing began, Frederick led her onto the floor for the first waltz, and Eleanor remembered with sudden clarity the wedding, 3 months before when she had stood in her pale lavender dress watching Lydia and Greville take their first turn while she nursed the private wounds of yet another season without a single offer. And the contrast between that woman and the one now spinning in the Duke's arms seemed almost too vast to comprehend. "I believe you have ruined waltzing for me, with anyone else," Eleanor murmured as they turned past the watching guests, and Frederick's arms tightened around her as he replied that she need never dance with anyone else for the rest of her days if she preferred. A promise that sent warmth flooding through her despite the cool autumn air drifting through the open windows. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the candles had burned low, Frederick led Eleanor through the corridors of her new home to the private apartments that would now be hers, and she paused before the door with her heart racing not from fear, but from anticipation of beginning this new chapter in the arms of a man who had seen her clearly when everyone else had looked through her, and when he kissed her on the threshold before carrying her across it. Eleanor finally understood that her story had not ended on that summer day when she struck a duke, but had only just begun. The months that followed their wedding night unfolded like pages in a book Eleanor had never dared to write for herself, each day revealing new chapters of a happiness so complete it sometimes frightened her with its intensity. And as autumn deepened into winter, and winter softened into spring, she found herself transformed not only in circumstance, but in the very essence of how she moved through the world, no longer the overlooked spinster resigned to watching life from the margins, but a woman fully seen and cherished by a man whose love had rewritten every bitter story she had told herself during those long years of invisibility. Frederick proved to be exactly the husband his courtship had promised, and somehow even more, attentive without smothering, protective without condescension, and possessed of an ability to make her laugh that she had never suspected lurked beneath his notorious coldness. And Eleanor discovered that the Duke of Somerton, who had terrified London society, was in private moments capable of remarkable tenderness, of reading aloud to her by firelight, of leaving books on her pillow with passages marked that reminded him of conversations they had shared, of looking at her across crowded ballrooms with an expression that made her feel as though they were the only two people in existence. The Dowager Duchess softened considerably as the months passed, won over by Eleanor's quiet strength and sharp wit, and perhaps, most of all, by the obvious joy her son had found after years of cold duty, and the sapphire brooch that had once adorned the older woman's throat now resided in Eleanor's jewelry box, presented with gruff affection and the declaration that the Ravenscroft legacy was in capable hands. Charlotte remained her dearest friend and frequent visitor to Ravenscroft Manor, delighting in her friend's elevation and finding in Frederick's library a paradise that kept her contentedly occupied during her extended stays. And Eleanor treasured these visits as proof that her essential self had not been lost in becoming a duchess, but had simply been given room to flourish. When spring arrived with its promise of renewal, Eleanor found herself one morning unable to face her breakfast, a peculiarity that repeated itself for several mornings thereafter, until the dowager observed her with knowing eyes and summoned the physician. And 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the library where Frederick had first kissed her, and watched his face transform from concern to wonder as she told him that the Ravenscroft nursery would soon have an occupant sure. He swept her into his arms with such careful reverence that she laughed despite her tears, and that evening they walked together beneath their oak tree as the sunset painted the Somerset sky in colours that echoed their proposal, and Eleanor thought of the woman she had been exactly 1 year before, standing in a church garden in her pale lavender dress, invisible and resigned, never imagining that a single moment of defiance would lead her here to this life beyond anything she had dared to dream. If you are listening to this story and you have ever felt unseen, Eleanor whispered to the evening air, as though speaking to all the overlooked souls who might somehow hear her, know that your chapter of recognition may come when you least expect it, and when it does, have the courage to believe you deserve every word of it.